Hey, Trooper Cody with a Ned Kelly story. This is one of the videos in the Ned Kelly series, and this particular one is about a guy called Alexander Fitzpatrick, Constable Fitzpatrick. So when you look at Ned Kelly and Ned Kelly stories, Ned Kelly mythology, what you'll see is reference in some ways to every criminal that's ever existed, doesn't matter what country they're in, which is basically, I didn't do it, it wasn't my fault, I was driven to it by somebody else, it was somebody else's fault. So in the case of Ned Kelly, and the Ned Kelly saga, Ned Kelly likes to blame Constable Fitzpatrick for a number of things, and the worst of which, of course, is when the whole Kelly family ganged up, conspired to accuse poor old Constable Fitzpatrick of sexual misconduct with a child. So what actually happened? There's plenty of sites out there about the Kellys where you will read or see all the terrible things that are alleged about Constable Fitzpatrick. But this guy was born in 1856, and he, near Ballarat in Victoria, he was seen to be a great horseman, a great person of great character. And so when he was only 20 years of age, the local police prosecutor for the area where this guy lived wrote to the police commissioner and said, this is the sort of man, the sort of character you need in the police force. When that police prosecutor wrote that to the then Victorian Police Commissioner, the Victorian Police consisted of 1,000 men. I can be specific about gender because there were no women, it was 1,000 men. Of those 1,000 men, 29 were born in Victoria. So the Commissioner got this reference, his good character, brilliant horseman, and he was at 20 taken into the Victorian Police and became the 30th Victorian person in the current 1876 Victorian Police. He was only a trooper for 3 months before he was deemed to be of such good character that he was transferred to the Benalla police station. And he served there for another year where he got glowing reports of his good conduct and good behaviour. So if we're going to, I've talked before a minute ago about criminals, it's never their fault, they always blame someone else. Well, equally, if you look at television, and I think the show Starsky and Hutch, whether I'm talking about the 70s police show or the send-up movie Starsky and Hutch, the thing that comes across here is these guys are gung-ho, they don't listen to their boss, they do everything themselves, they go off because they and how many cop shows are there where the hero doesn't listen to his boss? What would his boss know behind a desk, and he's going to do his own thing because he knows best, or she these days. But anyway, in those days some terrible things had already started to happen with the Kellys making accusations, and so the Commissioner made a directive that no one was ever to approach any of the Kellys or go to the Kelly premises by themselves. At least if there was 2 of them, there'd be some corroboration for allegations about misconduct. So what happened? So there's a previous video I've made about Dan Kelly and a couple of his mates going to a shop where the shopkeeper was away and his adult daughter was running the shop. A shocking story of about attempted rape and gross misconduct, gross indecency, and the eyewitness to that incident disappearing off the face of the planet and never being heard from again. So what happened is Constable Fitzpatrick, stationed at Benalla, over a year as a great officer, is posted to a horse racing event. When he's there, he sees and recognises Dan Kelly. He sees Kelly on a very distinctive bay horse, very recognisable horse. Really, if you saw a paddock of quarter horses of Cody's type breeding, you'd be hard pressed to pick one out. This was a very distinctive bay horse that Dan was riding. So Fitzpatrick is at those races all day. What happens is there's another police station not too far from Benalla, and the officer that's there gets very sick and can't work. They decide that Constable Fitzpatrick is doing such a good job as a good police officer. Let's give this bloke a chance and let's let him go and relieve the sick officer at this police station by himself, a one-man station that'll help add to his career and his references for future promotion and transfers. So that was the Greta police station. And when Fitzpatrick has to ride his horse, of course there's no other way to get between police stations in those days, when he has to ride his horse to the Greta police station, he has to pass the grog shop, the illicit hotel, the illegal premises that Ned Kelly's mother has, the shanty, where she sells illegal alcohol and is a prostitute there. He has to pass that. When he's just about to leave Benalla police station to ride to Greta, he finds out that Dan Kelly has now got a warrant out for him for that incident in the shop with that girl who ran off, barricaded herself in a room, ran off in fear because of the behaviour of Dan and his cohorts, attempted rape and sexual indecency, gross indecency. So now there's a warrant out for Dan. Fitzpatrick has to ride past the shanty to get to the Greta police station. When the allegations that are made by the Kellys, which are all that it was all Fitzpatrick was drunk and he sexually assaulted the 14-year-old girl and all this sort of thing, when those allegations are made, when it actually gets to the Royal Commission, and then we've got factual times, dates and witnesses, what happened is Fitzpatrick set off from the Benalla police station to ride to Greta at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He's riding a horse. Victorian police regulations at that time specifically state you will always travel at a walk and you will only exceed a walk in a case of emergency. Much like a police car today, if it wants to exceed the speed limit, it has to be engaged in a specific statutory function which warrants the lights on and the siren on, and then it can exceed the speed limit. Well, back then there were no lights and sirens, old mate, but you still had to be engaged in an emergency to exceed a walk. So, leaves at 2 in the afternoon. It's 11 miles to the shanty, not to Greta, it's 11 miles to the shanty. On the way to the shanty, he has to pass Lindsay's Hotel. Now, it's a long ride. He left at 2 in the afternoon. When he gets to Lindsay's Hotel, he stops. The Kellys allege he came to their shanty drunk. Publican himself serves him and says he had one shandy, a beer and lemonade mix, which weakens the beer, but it is a refreshing drink to cover you on the long ride. So having left at 2 p.m, he arrives at the shanty and it's still light. At 2 p.m, it's 11 miles just to the shanty, not to Greta. He stops at the hotel where the licensee of the hotel says he has one shandy beer and lemonade mix before he rides on. And everyone agrees, the Kellys agree, it was light when he got to the shanty. So that shows that he couldn't have had many drinks at the hotel, no matter, even if the licensee didn't support him, because there really wasn't time. If he still got, it was going to be, the sun was going to be setting 5:30, and he got there in daylight. So when he gets there, instead of riding past, instead of doing what the commissioner's directive was, which was never approach the Kellys or go to the shanty by yourself, always have a backup officer, he didn't do that. He rode into the shanty looking for Dan Kelly. Now when he got there, what would any police officer do? This is you're looking for a particular person, you go to the house. There's no need to upset other family members. He arrives there and he asks for Dan, and he's cordial and he's friendly. But Dan isn't there, and they claim that Dan isn't there. So he goes to leave. By the time he's leaving, the sun has set and it's dusk, and as he rides off, he sees some horses and riders approaching the shanty, and what is so distinctive is that he recognises one of those horses. He turns around, he goes back to the shanty. When he gets back to the shanty, he sees, yes, there's one person with the 3 horses, and one of those horses is the bay that Dan had been riding at the races. He asks where Dan is. Dan comes out of the shanty, and that's when Fitzpatrick says to Dan, there's a warrant out for you, I have to arrest you, I'm compelled to arrest you. This legislation still exists today. When a court issues a warrant for someone, a police officer sees that person, they're compelled to arrest them. They don't have the option, if they want to say, we'll see you later, or come to the police station, because you're in breach of a court order yourself if you do that. So Fitzpatrick tells Dan Kelly he has no option, he has to arrest him. So then Dan says, I'm halfway through eating my tea, can I just go and finish my tea? Now all along, anything that's ever been said about Fitzpatrick is what a nice bloke he is. And so, there's a saying, isn't there, good guys finish last? Well, poor old Fitzpatrick says, yep, finish your tea. So Dan walks back into the shanty, Fitzpatrick follows him in. When he follows him in, Ellen Kelly, the mother of Dan and Ned, has a reputation, fiery temper, let's just leave it at that, as fiery temper, gets angry, short fuse, and then becomes violent. She then rushes at Fitzpatrick with a shovel raised as if to hit him on the head. He steps back to defend himself. When he does this, Ned comes in. There's a bit of a melee, a bit of a disturbance, a family disturbance going on. Ned walks in. Ned has a variety of stories about what he did, but when Ned walks in, he immediately fires his handgun. The shot hits the wall. The disturbance now is already getting louder. Ellen successfully hits Fitzpatrick on the head. These things aren't disputed by anyone. Fitzpatrick, stunned, is stumbling for his holster. There's another shot fired, and that shot from Ned Kelly's pistol hits Fitzpatrick in the wrist. At this point, Fitzpatrick faints. When Fitzpatrick comes round, the first thing he does is he reaches for his holster, and he finds his holster is empty and his gun's missing. His police-issued gun is on the table, and it's dismantled and the ammunition's taken out of it, the revolver. Kelly asks Fitzpatrick, have you more ammunition for the handgun? and he doesn't, because the Victorian police were not issued with any extra ammunition, not even ammunition for training purposes. He says he has no extra ammunition. At this point, there's no doubt in this time that Kelly and the Kelly gang have murdered people. Well, I've talked about this in other videos about the witnesses to various matters who all mysteriously disappeared and their bodies were never recovered. Morris was one of them. That was the woman, the girl in the shop. And then another one was Whitlow. Now Whitlow was a pound keeper, and Whitlow was going to go to court and he was going to testify that a person who had been selling stock at the Vanilla Pound under an assumed name was actually Ned Kelly. Now that was what his testimony was going to be, and that person disappeared. The body, to this day, that person's body has never been found. What Kelly said to Fitzpatrick is, I don't want to have to kill you, I want to let you go, but how can I let you go when you have a bullet wound in your wrist? So Kelly said to Fitzpatrick, I'll let you go if you're prepared to tell your bosses and the authorities that you were riding along, bush rangers robbed you, shot you, and you heard one of those bush rangers say, Whitlow, use the name Whitlow, and it was Whitlow that shot you. Now, why would Kelly make up that story? Why would Kelly suggest that story with a specific name? Because Kelly knew Whitlow was already dead, Whitlow was never going to be found, and so he could say to Fitzpatrick, blame it on Whitlow, because no one's ever going to find Whitlow's body, never going to find a person who can say, hang on, it wasn't him. So Fitzpatrick said, that's a great idea, I'll do that. Yep, Ned, I'll do that. You'd say anything to get away. He then rode back to Lindsay's pub. At this stage, Fitzpatrick has not even spoken to that 14-year-old girl, Ned's sister. He hasn't gone near her, hasn't approached her. His testimony is some of the time she ran off and she wasn't even around when he was at the shanty, and other times when she was in the shanty, she just sat in a chair crying. When he gets back to Lindsay's hotel, Lindsay, again, in further testimony, says Fitzpatrick was stone cold sober, had the bullet wound, and because he was in shock, Lindsay says he gave Fitzpatrick, Alexander Fitzpatrick, he was 22 at this time, he gave him a brandy to help settle his nerves, calm him down, while they would continue the journey from the hotel back to Benalla for Fitzpatrick to see a doctor. When he got there, and the doctor's making accurate notes of Fitzpatrick's condition, the doctor writes he can smell alcohol on Fitzpatrick's breath. What a tragedy. The man had just been given one shot of brandy to calm his nerves at the police station before he was taken to the doctor, at the Lindsay's home. The man was given one shot of brandy by Lindsay at Lindsay's hotel to help calm his nerves and help him until he got to the doctor at Benalla. Now, because the doctor said he smelled alcohol in his breath, this is where all the Ned Kelly crazies, the fanatics that love the man, this is where they say Fitzpatrick was drunk when he got to the shanty. He misbehaved at the shanty. Ned only shot him because he was sexually assaulting the 14-year-old girl. And then, of course, this is again, then they say, and the proof of this is the doctor that treated him for the gunshot wound says he was drunk. But he never said he was drunk. He said he could smell alcohol in his breath from that one brandy. So these are all the sad facts that have accumulated against Fitzpatrick for an incident that I've explained to you. What a shame he went there at all. What a shame he didn't have another officer with him. How things could have been so different. The blessings are, thank goodness he didn't leave Benalla till 2 p.m. because it shows that if he left in uniform, sober at 2 p.m, he could never have been drunk by the time he got to the shanty and say he'd been carrying a flask of his own. You know, if he came up with that excuse. He just didn't have time to get drunk from when he saw Lindsay at Lindsay's hotel and had 1 week shandy. So what has happened from all this? What's the end result of all this? We've got a young man who had a brilliant reference given to him by the police commissioner. We had a young constable who's had glowing reports about his behaviour, who then has a bit of a stuff up. You speak to any copper, anyone that's ever been a copper, and my God, we've all had incidents that have happened to us. I pulled a woman over for speeding one night about 2 in the morning. There were 2 of us. She was a bit chatty, not even flirting or anything like that. She was just chatting and talked to us. And she kept us talking for about 20 minutes or so for a simple speeding offence before we left. And then the allegations came in that I kept her on the side of the road. I was flirting with her and I was embarrassing her and so that's just one of countless allegations. I arrested a man. It's interesting, a warrant. I'm talking to you about warrants and you have no option but to arrest the person. And I went to a man's house once. I was by myself, working by myself, checking on warrants. I went to a man's house. He answered the door. When he answered the door, he was wearing his underpants and a singlet and nothing on his feet. I said I had to arrest him. I had no option to arrest him. And his attitude was, righto mate, arrest me. Can you go and put some clothes on? I'll put some shoes on, get some thong. So this man flatly refused and was quite belligerent, saying, I'm in my undies and this is how you're going to take me. So I arrested him and I took him to the police station, barefoot, in his underpants and his singlet, and it was not a pretty sight. He was an overweight man. What happened was he arranged that when he was released from the police station, the newspaper was there, and he came out, and thank goodness in those days, this was a few years ago, there was no television crews around, it was just a newspaper story. But he arranged for a newspaper reporter to be there, and photos were taken of him out there in front of the Elizabeth police station in his underpants and singlet, and an outrage at how he was arrested and dragged from his house by a brutal police, SS-style police officer. They used to love using those G words and N words back then. And so that made a newspaper story. And of course, what do you reckon happened to me? Hauled over the clock. I had a second one ripped for me because that's just how things were. What were you supposed to do? Well, this is the same sort of thing. The Kelly debacle. They can't, so then when it goes on, they can't catch the Kellys. The Stringy Bark Massacre. The cops have seemed to be ineffectual and useless and they can't find. So every boss is looking for a scapegoat. And there is no better scapegoat to say it's all Fitzpatrick's fault, he's a useless copper, he's mismanagement, he should never be in the job. All of those same old boss cliches roll out about Fitzpatrick. And can you imagine post-traumatic stress he would have suffered from something like that? He was actually shot. And then far from being supported by his superiors, he's actually maligned by them. It is very, very sad that that man only lasted another 2 years in the job before he left, was no longer a police officer, and didn't have the best of life remaining. After he died, it was found he had a liver disease, and that poor bloke, because then he's died and it is still not over for him, because when you now look at Kelly sites and the lunatics that support Ned Kelly, they say he was a drunkard. The proof of the drunk, he was a drunkard his whole life, he was a drunkard after he left the job, and the proof of this is he died of cirrhosis of the liver, and he didn't. He died of he died of a liver disease that was of no relationship or caused by alcohol. But that poor bastard still can't get away even after his death. So here, really you could say is a tribute to a police officer of the past, a tribute to Constable Alexander Fitzpatrick, who was a very promising young police officer. I nearly used the F word, whose life was destroyed by the Kellys, pretty much as similar as were the 4 officers at Stringy Bark, 3 of whom were massacred. Pretty long video. Alexander Fitzpatrick, Constable, long since departed, deserves a bit of justification, I think. Till next time, coppers. Cheers.